Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We got a couple of things to talk about today. Wanted to start with this article that you sent me, Adam, talking about Microsoft and bug bounty payouts. Before we get started, since we are talking about Microsoft, you want to give a quick disclaimer, Adam?
Sure. Andy and I both work for Microsoft in field security sales. However, we do this show outside of work on our own time and self-fund the show. The opinions you're about to hear are those of Adam Brewer and Andy Jha and do not reflect those of Microsoft Corporation.
All right, and on with the show here. So this was super interesting. Microsoft talked to, at Black Hat Europe. Tom Gallagher, who's the VP of Engineering at Microsoft Security Response Center, otherwise known as MSRC, told an audience at Black Hat Europe that Microsoft is overhauling its bug bounty program, that they're going to reward exploit hunters for finding vulnerabilities across all of its products and services, even those without established bounty schemes. And so that's really interesting because I think this is the first company really to do something like that. That we're adopting something called always in scope, or in scope by default, meaning that if you find a vulnerability of some sort, it's going to be considered in scope right away, and you'll get something for it. So under this new model, MSRC will pay researchers who report critical vulnerabilities that have a demonstrable impact on Microsoft's online service. And that's written really vague because regardless of whether the code is owned or managed by Microsoft, a third party, or is open source, Microsoft will do whatever it takes to remediate the issue. So if it affects anything, even if we don't own the code, we're going to do something about it. The same class of vulnerability and its severity will attract the same monetary reward in a third-party code base as if it were to be found in one of Microsoft's products. And where no bounty programs exist, Microsoft's going to recognize and award the diverse insights of the security research community, whatever their expertise takes them. So this includes domains and corporate infrastructures that are owned and managed by Microsoft. It's a pretty big shift in MSRC's bug bounty, where in the past you had to be very prescriptive in terms of what the type of the bug warrant an award and what products and services were eligible. So super interesting. I know, Adam, you have some thoughts about this, but great to hear that whatever affects Microsoft, they're going to work on fixing that, even if the code is not owned by them.
As I've stated on this show many times, obviously the goal is to write secure code, write great code. Developers in all industries and all backgrounds should have that as their North Star. However, in reality, not all code will be secure. Attackers are clever and creative and diverse throughout the world, and they're going to find ways to exploit software. It is a cat and mouse game. Responsible disclosure and responsible patching and delivery of code updates is a critical part of modern cybersecurity. And so I have always been very positive on the show about, instead of chicken littling whenever the sky is falling, that another vulnerability was found in a piece of popular software, we should be thankful for security researchers who go hunt these vulnerabilities, bug bounty programs that allow them to make a living doing that, and responsible and coordinated vulnerability disclosure that allows us to responsibly resolve these concerns and then ship updated code before they're exploited in the wild. That's the system working as intended. And I've been very on my soapbox about that on this show many different times. I have noticed, as we've recorded this show for more than 5 years now, that there is sometimes a perception that some of these bug bounty programs are, using the language from the article, Andy, overly prescriptive in terms of what will be supported, almost nitpicky about, well, that's in scope or that's out of scope, or we don't support that because that's not technically our code. And so moving to a model where it's, if you find a vulnerability in a Microsoft Online service, we're not going to come back and nitpick you and say, well, technically that was a third-party library, so it doesn't count. We're going to pay those security researchers. And I think that's terrific. I think moving to a model where as much as possible it is in scope by default is a great model. It's going to attract security research talent to continue to poke at Microsoft, not to mention, as we've seen throughout time, when you do find a vulnerability in a Microsoft Online service, you can generate a lot of clicks and get a lot of eyeballs to it as well. And you can make even more money from maybe your Google Ads revenue than you can from a bug bounty. I kid a little bit, but in all seriousness, this is great. Great news, hopefully spreads throughout the industry. And this article was posted in the Register, which, if you're familiar with, has a pretty dim view of Microsoft most of the time. So this is even some positive press from them, and they're pretty tough to win positive praise from. By the way, total side note, one thing I didn't realize and learn from this article is that Microsoft was relatively late in establishing a bug bounty program, didn't have one in place till 2013. That predates both of our employment with Microsoft Andy, but it is a little late in the game. I know Apple was another one that was pretty late to it as well. And I'm thankful today, as we start to wrap up 2025, that that's something we can almost take for granted nowadays, that most every major software platform and software organization has a robust bug bounty program. And I look forward to Microsoft leading by example here and other organizations adopting a similar approach. Very exciting.
And also, what a change in attitude over the, history of bug bounties in general, because I'm actually going through and reading the book This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends by Nicole Perroth. It's about just cybersecurity in general, and one of the things she kind of goes over is just how cloak and dagger the security researchers used to have to be, that if they found something, these companies, Microsoft included, but also Google and other ones, would treat them like criminals. Like, hey, why are you poking around in my code?
Mhm.
And she had this one story of one of the researchers where he was working on something for Google, and Google actually looked up his employer and then copied his boss on an email saying, hey, like, just so you know, your employee, was poking around in our code and they found this vulnerability. They're working with us to solve it, but hey, you shouldn't be doing that kind of thing. And so it's just what a difference, that now pretty much not only is Microsoft, welcoming this type of activity, but also anything that might affect a Microsoft service is in scope automatically. So I just thought that was really interesting.
What was the book again?
This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends.
This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. And you've been very effusive in your praise of Nicole Perloff's work as of late on some of our group chats and whatnot.
Yeah. She wrote the book. It's been several years since she wrote that book, but I think every cybersecurity practitioner would benefit from kind of reading the book, because there's a lot of history of how vulnerabilities in cybersecurity, the hacking culture. She talks about like the early days of where the United States thought we were so good at everything and we didn't know what we didn't know, and the Russians had found a way to hack electronic typewriters. There's some sort of electromagnetic, tube that they somehow got into the supply chain and were able to, or insider or whatever, and placed it inside their electronic typewriters, essentially hacking the endpoint. That kind of started with the whole, let's capture the information before it's encrypted and inputted. So they, that's that whole idea of hacking the endpoint didn't exist until the CIA or the NSA discovered that the Russians had actually hacked these electronic keyboards, typewriters. So really good book.
Very cool. Yeah. And she was involved with that podcast series you were way big on recently too. And what was that?
To Catch a Thief. Yeah. And that's all about China specifically. But yeah,
Well, I just recognized the name as you brought it up because I know you've been plugging it. I think you've posted on LinkedIn about it. You've talked about it in our group chat. So
absolutely.
I was promoting a couple of books last week, and so it feels like it's your turn this week. So I wanted to make sure we got that out there. Perfect.
All right. So this next bit of news here, CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is going to increase its hiring efforts in 2026 after rebuilding what happened during this administration where there were a lot of cuts. And there's a memo, interesting enough, we talked last week about China, and the memo from the acting CISA director, Madhu Gautamudlika. I can't really say what that name is, but anyways, he's the acting CISA director. And yeah, he in his memo in November 5th talked about where CISA needs to increase its efforts because of this potential conflict with China. So roughly this year, there have been over 1,000 people that have left CISA, either by choice and payouts or through layoffs. And that's about a third of its overall workforce. And so the acting CISA director said that the efforts for trying to prepare for this potential conflict with China is being hampered because there are approximately a 40% vacancy rate across key mission areas. And what's interesting enough, also, this memo that he talked about, experts predict a crisis in 2027. And that's a number that the military has looked at. A lot of folks have looked at because it is the 100th year anniversary of the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army. There's also going to be a fifth Congress that's going to be convening where Xi Jinping, who is the current president, will be seeking and will probably be elected a fourth unprecedented term. So it's a big year in like the books, and so they're kind of predicting that there's going to be something that happens during that time frame. And so, as part of the new workforce strategy, CISA is promising to prioritize the hiring of state cybersecurity coordinators and regional cybersecurity advisors in regions that are considered persistent vacancies. A lot of those vacancies are the result of Trump administration policies, and the personnel who served in these vital liaisons between CISA and critical infrastructure across the country have been among the hardest hit for layoffs and voluntary departure. In addition, CISA is expanding its use of the Department of Homeland Security's Cyber Talent Management System, which is a special hiring program to recruit critical cyber talent at market rates, focusing on junior practitioners and experienced industry experts. As I looked at this, I just thought it's super interesting that we created kind of this crisis, and now we're trying to rehire talent. And my question is, like, who is going to apply for these jobs? Because I worked a lot with government civilians. I still do today. And in general, they usually had a smaller salary, but people went into government because, they wanted to serve in a capacity probably, or it had good benefits. And most importantly, job stability was kind of the key cornerstone of government jobs. But as we've seen in this administration, that's really not the case anymore. And so, if I was a talented cybersecurity person, I wouldn't be looking at a government job today. And I think that is a detriment to our overall national security, unfortunately, in this case.
I agree. I live in Iowa, which has steadily become a deep red crimson state over the past decade or so. And one of the trends I've observed is almost this vilification of people who work in government service. And you don't have to be that old to remember when we referred to people as public servants who worked in government service. Literally, it was seen as honorable to serve the public because you are taking less money to help your state, to help your country, and giving up the money to do that because you believed in the mission. And I think people from all walks of life can agree on being efficient and using resources effectively and not overhiring and right sizing. Those are all valid goals. But doing that in a way that doesn't seem haphazard, doesn't seem like you're vilifying people who work in the government like it's a bad thing. It is an honorable thing. And to your point, Andy, how are you going to attract great talent when it is seemed as I'm going to be vilified. I could be at risk of random chainsaw type cuts at any point, when I could go work in private sector, sorry, in the private sector, maybe doesn't have a lot of stability right now either, especially in the big tech space. But compared to this whipsaw effect of hearing someone talk about, oh, we have persistent vacancies and we need to hire to strengthen our mission, then what were you doing 9 months ago? Is there no higher level plan? And those are all rhetorical questions.
Yeah.
This is not a political podcast, but I agree with you. This is a concern that CISA performs a very important, valid mission for cybersecurity defenders. We have hurt the agency's ability to do that. And I think the overall temperature and attitude towards government work right now makes it unattractive for people. Market rate is not enough. You may have to pay over market rate, or you have to accept that you will not be able to attract top talent. And then it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy where you villainize government work, you terrorize government workers through random and arbitrary cuts, and then you justify it by saying, see, these people aren't any good at their jobs. Well, who is working in them other than those who maybe lack for better options? So it's all part of a virtuous cycle. And that's really disappointing. And it does hurt our ability to be effective on a global stage, which, as we unpacked last week, is this persistent threat. And it's something that we have generally kind of ignored and almost delegated to private business, that it's your job to protect your own industry and it's your job to protect your own organization. Whereas we provide strong defense in a kinetic sense, in a physical sense, but we're not doing the same in the cyber landscape. And that's a mistake. We should treat that as co-equal with all forms of antagonistic behavior from bad actors around the world. So I think you and I are very well aligned on this, Andy. We see the challenge here. And I think the acting director sincerely has good purposes here, good goals, and is being somewhat hamstrung by the larger political landscape on how we have treated public servants. And that's a shame. And I think we need to get back to treating public service as honorable and as people who are choosing to make a sacrifice because they believe in the mission, because, and this has become a loaded term too, but I think it is patriotic. You are a patriot to do public service. And that word has been co-opted as meaning a political meaning, and it should not. It can just mean you love your country. And maybe you love your country because you're willing to take less pay than you could in private industry because you want to help protect our country and our world against some threat actors that are well-funded and well-resourced from our antagonistic other nations around the world. So I'll get off my soapbox here because it's a little out of scope for this show, but definitely some challenges ahead, and certainly wish them nothing but success and able to get some really great talent. And, you know, I think if you are willing to kind of deal with some of those challenges, you can really connect yourself to a great mission there. I think they do great work and you can be proud of what you do. And I know on this show, you will always have champions, and Andy and I, as people who are performing public service in CISA and other organizations that help protect our cyber landscape.
And then looking at strategy, I thought this was a great article to kind of follow the CISA one. The US is making some changes to its cybersecurity strategy. And this was kind of put out in July. And then there's been more officials as part of this administration have kind of talked more about this shift from defense to offense. And so the US is pursuing a single coordinated cyber strategy, taking on a more aggressive stance against groups that attack US companies, government agencies, and the citizen. In the One Big Beautiful Bill, which was done in July, that slashed about $1 billion from the US cyber defense budget, but moving that to offensive operations. The bill describe exactly what offensive operations were, but it just kind of said this is the way that things are going. And just to note, we've always had offensive operations. We've had a budget for it, but I think I might have mentioned this back in March. One of the things that this administration did was suspend offensive cyber operations against Russia back in March. And that's just kind of noting it's interesting that they're shifting to offense, but we're going to stop against specifically Russia. That's just interesting facts about this administration. And then in late November, just a few weeks ago, the White House National Cyber Director said that Trump's administration plans to release an updated cyber strategy. The last one was put out by the Biden administration, but this one is going to be put out by the Trump administration. It's going to take a more aggressive stance toward attackers, deepen public-private partnership aimed to fill cybersecurity roles, and combine the efforts of disparate federal agencies. Now, a lot of that's really good. I wanted to just highlight the deepen of the public and private partnerships, because I think in general, just if you look at, again, this is not a political podcast, but if you just look at like kind of historically what Republicans have wanted is smaller government in general. And so cutting the role, the number of people at CISA, reducing the agency, reducing, waste, fraud, and abuse, that's kind of in line with the overall like strategy of the Republican Party in general. But then this public-private partnership, it sounds like they may, instead of hire, they may, put out contracts to private companies to supplement some of this stuff. Again, kind of looking at the big picture, this is somewhat in line with how things have gone. But I fear, like working with contractors and government contracts, that sometimes, these are for-profit companies. And so not to say that people take advantage of government contracts, but there's certainly a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in there too with these large contracts. So that's what I fear there. But the National Cyber Director, he said that they're going to be focusing on shaping adversary behavior, introducing cost and consequences into this mix. I think as a country, we haven't done a terrific job of sending a signal to our adversaries and that this behavior is not consequence free. And so we need to do that because the threat is scaling and becoming more aggressive every passing day. Like I said, this is something that the U.S. has already been doing. We're involved in these kind of conflicts in cyberspace. But the biggest difference is most of the time it's law enforcement agencies and kind of taking down criminal groups. And there is a big difference between taking down cyber criminal infrastructure and attacking the systems and networks of a rival nation. And without like kind of set rules, that risk of escalation is pretty big. And so I think, one of the things that needs to happen is that risk of escalation needs to be talked about in this national strategy that's getting put out. But anyways, I thought that was interesting, that mindset shift. And this is not something that's just the US. Like across the world, people are kind of balancing that defense and offensive cyber capability among many of the countries in the world. So I don't think this is anything bad. I just fear of kind of number one, that we're going to use private companies to kind of bolster this effort, as well as there's really no clear cut kind of definitive lines of, what can we do? Where is that line getting crossed?
All valid points. And I want to start with that quote from the National Cyber Director. It's going to be focused on shaping adversary behavior, introducing costs and consequences into this mix. I think as a country, we have not done a terrific job of sending a signal to our adversaries that this behavior is not consequence free. And we need to do that because the threat is scaling and is becoming more aggressive every passing day. I had just said when we discussed the previous news item that we haven't done a good job at this. There has been, I think, this perception that for the most part, it's for private organizations to fend for themselves. It's for the water company to protect their own infrastructure and the gas pipeline to protect their own infrastructure, and Microsoft and Google and Apple at great expense, tremendous expense, to protect themselves. And so it would be nice for this to be recognized because, again, if these were physical attacks, if China launched a warhead at Apple Park in Cupertino, it would be perceived very differently than a nation state attempting to break into Microsoft systems every single day. We've always treated that as different. And to your point, Andy, as this has shifted from cyber criminals and criminal organizations and organized crime to nation state driven, we haven't really shifted our mindset with it. And some of this does sound positive. I agree with you that public private partnership can be a euphemism for giving out lucrative contracts without competitive bidding processes and giving it to donors and allies and doing it in a very fraudulent and wasteful way. And as we have undergone this effort where we are allegedly very concerned with rooting that out, what's really been happening is, to the point I made previously, we've gutted the perception and value of public service while at the same time going and handing out huge contracts through non-competitive processes to political allies. And that also, if you are really concerned with fraud and waste, should be co-equal. Those are one and the same. Dollars wasted are dollars wasted. And I think we all can agree those are noble and good goals to root that out, but let's treat it all equally and not just what is most expedient to our political whims. So that said, I think this is also positive. We need a articulated cyber strategy. We need to keep it up to date with the current state of affairs in cyber warfare. And so this is overall very positive. I think your closing thought was spot on. We, of course, need to be aware of consequences. It's one thing to start rattling some sabers, so to speak, and start talking some big talk. Are you prepared for the consequences that come with that? And we need to be mindful of that, especially if we are going to shift from a defensive posture to an offensive posture and start antagonizing our enemies. And who are our enemies? Because sometimes it seems like if we're suspending operations against Russia, then who's the enemy? I thought they were, So there's more to come here, of course, and this will continue to unfold. But at a high level, having an articulated and clear cyber strategy is good. Just watch for some of those red flags that Andy and I both highlighted, and we'll see how those play out. And I will give the benefit of the doubt, and I will assume positive intent. And I hope we have a really great cyber strategy that we can all be proud of and align ourselves behind. But there are some red flags there that I will be monitoring closely and will, of course, bring you updates on this show.
All right. I wanted to close out with the OWASP top 10. So this was updated in 2025. The last time it was updated was 2021. And I believe we actually had a show on it as well. So wanted to just quickly talk about kind of the changes, because this looks, when you look at the changes between the last OWASP top 10 in 2021 and the recent update, you can kind of see the trends are shifting. And we can kind of talk about that, what each one kind of means. So we'll just talk through each one real quick. The number one, which is broken access control, stayed the same. This is still the number one issue. And if anything, the AI assisted development, DevOps, is making it worse, because AI is really great at writing that functional happy path, but it's really terrible at understanding the authorization boundings or that negative path. One of the things that went away, which was 10 on the previous one, number 10, was server-side request forgery. That was merged into this category, is no longer a standalone bug. And that's where the authorization failure of the server is granted access where it shouldn't have. And so that stayed that one went away in general, which was number 10 from last year. And then that merged into this broken access control.
So that goes back to the old Brett Arsenault, former CISO at Microsoft. Attackers don't break in, they log in.
The new runner-up is moved from number 5 to number 2. And so that kind of tells you a lot about just modern DevOps. And This is security misconfigurations. So this is usually where like you have unnecessary features enabled, or you have default accounts, the classic cloud sprawl, where you have buckets or lambdas or containers that are left open, or someone forgot to a false flag or something like that in Terraform. And so um, security misconfigurations, right? Like where you would look at cloud security posture management to kind of analyze that and make sure you have your configurations done correctly. This went up significantly from 2021 to 2025. So I thought that was interesting because still
So
still a problem.
number one is broken access control. Number two is security misconfiguration. So I think of story quickly unfolding here, and one we've made on this show forever. People get so wound up over these 0 days and these really sophisticated attacks. And number one and number two are broken access controls and misconfiguration. It goes back to just doing the basics, being really buttoned up on your posture management, being really buttoned up on your configuration, and of course, your access management and access control. That's your number one and number two, not people using a super sophisticated 0 day where they have to hack the Gibson and do all these things and whatever. Anyhow, continue, Andy. It's worth reiterating over and over that people get way too wound up over 0 days and way not wound up enough on doing the basics because they're completely unsexy. And it's still the way more than ever that compromise happens.
Number 3 is this new one that moved in, which shows you kind of the direction of DevOps: software supply chain failures. And so, this is where you have kind of the integrity of the entire ecosystem of your DevOps, where do you really know where that Docker container came from, or did your developer just do an npm install of like a typo squatted package because the AI hallucinated the name? Or if you don't have an SBOM, a software bill of materials, like of everything that's going into your DevOps, then you are flying blind. And so I think oftentimes, just like with anything in security, you can't defend what you don't know exists. And so the first thing you do is inventory. Like you need to have an inventory of your identities. You need to have an inventory of your devices. Need to have an inventory of your data. So if you don't know what's there, how do you know how to defend it? And so, you need to know what's going into your software. So there's been quite a few supply chain hacks recently, and hacking the repos in GitHub or the different libraries. So this is the new heavyweight, the number 3 for 2025.
And that is somewhat of an update of the 2021 number 6, which was vulnerable and outdated components. They rolled that into number 3 as software supply chain.
Number 4, 5, and 6 stayed the same in that order, but they slipped. And so they were 2, 3, and 4 from 2021, but they slipped to 4, 5, and 6. So number 4 was cryptographic failures, still dangerous, but we're getting better because the frameworks are getting better at doing that heavy lifting for us. The risk is still, if you are leaking, private keys into a repo, it's not that like we're rolling our own crypto anymore, but if you're leaking a private key, or if you're using like a weak Diffie-Hellman group in the TLS config or something like that. And so still an issue, but slipping because frameworks are doing a better job. Number 5 is injection. Still something that's pretty important. It used to be even worse, but modern ORMs, which is object relationship relational mapping, have in part killed classic SQL injection. Still exists if you're looking for it, but in general, the new way of doing DevOps with SQL databases has changed. And so, but one of the things that's important is you don't want to get too comfortable, because even though SQL injection is dying, command injection and prompt injection in LLMs, which is a different OWASP top 10. There's a whole nother OWASP top 10 for LLMs, but that is filling the void. And so the mechanism is the same: untrusted input hijacking the control flow. So while SQL injection might be on the downward trend, we have same technique being used in AI today. And then number 6 is insecure design. Again, this slipped from the last time in 2021. This whole category captures that shift left failure. If you can't really patch a flaw that's baked into the architecture. So if you're storing passwords in plain text or weak ciphers, you're trusting client-side validation, failing to rate limit expensive APIs. We just talked about a few weeks ago how the WhatsApp API wasn't rate limited. These are all insecure designs, and so that slipped, but still in the top 10. And then 7, 8, and 9 were exactly the same from the last time this was put out. Number 7 is authentication failures. We're getting better at passwords, and MFA is helping, but we're getting worse at session management in general. So instead of guessing passwords, attackers are stealing the session tokens. And so if your session times out are too long or your token rotation is weak, that MFA won't save you. And we've talked about how, a lot of companies have MFA, and now what's the next thing, right? So still a big deal for authentication failures. Number 8 is software or data integrity failures. Distinct from the supply chain, this focuses on internal integrity. And so this is where an attacker might inject code into your CI/CD pipeline or modify that application after the code review, but before the deployment. So if you aren't signing your artifacts, you have no way to prove what is running in your production is what you approved in Git. And then number 9 is logging and alerting failures. This is like that silent killer because a lot of companies, they log way too much noise and not enough signal. And if your attacker is able to brute force your login for 4 hours with no alert going off, then you failed in this category. To note, the AI analysis of logs is on the rise, but whether or not that will help this category, we'll probably have to look at the next iteration to see if this one falls off here. And then new for 2025 is mishandling of exceptional conditions. So this is an interesting addition because this is more like what happens if your system fails? Does it fail securely closed, or does it crash, or does it dump a stack trace with environment variables to the user, leave the connection open? And so in that age of microservices that we have today, errors are really consistent. So mishandling those errors or ignoring them or failing open is a new vulnerability class that we're dealing with here. So kind of like to-dos, as you look at this, some of the things that popped out is, have that software bill of materials, right? That SBOM is really not an option anymore. We got to know what's going into the code. If you don't know what's running, you can't really patch it. And then making sure that we have this rise of security misconfigurations. So you want to make sure that you have some sort of CSPM in place. This is going to be part of the basics. And we need to stop treating security as a code problem in DevOps and start treating it as an engineering, like a security engineering problem. So any thoughts there, Adam?
I think about what expected. I pointed out at the top that so much of this is very much within your control, within some of the access management, access control, and secure configuration concepts. And then some of it gets harder. I mean, software supply chain all the way up to number 3, that is tough. And Andy, you gave the most actionable thing you can do is have that software bill of materials. And I know there's a lot of vendors that have popped on the market to help with that. And certainly we've talked about on this show the challenges with that. And this is an industry-wide problem. XKCD that I've called out before, they have that great comic I always talk about with the hit the guy with the hammer, but that's not the one I'm talking about. They have another one that's really great that it's all modern infrastructure, and it's effectively this pile of stuff built on top of other stuff. And it's all hinging on some tiny little open source package that's maintained by a single guy in Nebraska or whatever. And that's just how we write code today. We just include these open source libraries without really knowing a lot about them or how they're maintained or anything else. And it's not for your organization to solve. It's for us as an industry to continue to find a way to mature this and move it forward. Open source has so many great benefits. It is greatly simplified software development where we can use object-oriented programming and bring in these libraries so we don't have to re-implement stuff that's already solved. talk about cryptography here and how a lot of the library-driven support for that has been, you don't have to roll your own encryption. You don't have to roll your own crypto library, which is great. And that makes for better code until there's a heartbleed type incident within that cryptographic library. And so that's the challenge that comes with the positive benefits of it too. So that one's really hard to kind of wrap our mind around. And, cryptographic failures, injection, insecure design. As you go through this list, some of them, the top 10, I think, is prioritized in terms of risk and prevalence. But there's some of these that are kind of quote unquote easier for you to make a difference on than others. And so, of course, I always say focus there. Focus where you can make the greatest impact with the lowest amount of effort. And things like broken access control, security misconfigurations, they're not easy to solve, but they are getting easier with things like modern cloud security posture management, as an example. You can get a really robust list of things that you should be changing and updating in your configuration. And the various cloud providers all have built-in capabilities there, Microsoft, Google, Amazon. And then there's really strong competitors in that space, Palo Alto, Wiz, as well as CrowdStrike. I'll do a lot in that space too. So there is an opportunity. I see a lot of the customers I work with are still really immature in this space. And so there's a huge opportunity to rapidly improve your posture on things like that. But overall, OWASP, always great conversation piece, if nothing else, and a great way to kind of map your view of the world against this consensus view of the world. Doesn't mean they're one and the same, but a good way to kind of set your prioritization and what your go-dos are in 2026.
All right. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. The links to the topics that we talked about will be in the show notes, as well as our contact information if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.